Tonight, we begin with a question history narrowly avoided answering. What if the world's most brutal empire had never fallen? What if the swastika still cast its shadow across continents, and freedom existed only in whispers? In this story, there is no D-Day, no Allied victory, no fall of Berlin. Operation Sea Lion succeeded. Britain crumbled. And the world watched as the Reich rose, unchallenged, into the decades beyond. This is not just an alternate timeline. It is a glimpse into the silence that might have followed, the cultures that might have vanished, and the lives that history was one wrong turn from forgetting. A world where resistance is a death sentence, and survival means obedience. Chapter 1: The Fall of Britain. The summer of 1940 was unrelenting. The skies over London roared with the drone of Heinkel bombers, their shadows flickering across the Thames as air raid sirens wailed into the night. The Battle of Britain, as history might have called it, had tipped decisively in favor of the Luftwaffe. By August, the Royal Air Force was a skeleton of its former self, its Spitfires and Hurricanes grounded by relentless attrition. The German air campaign, refined after months of missteps, had achieved what seemed impossible: air superiority over the British Isles. Eleanor Caldwell, a typist-turned-resistance fighter, crouched in the basement of a shattered pub in Whitechapel, her hands trembling as she clutched a smuggled Sten gun. The weapon felt foreign, its cold metal a stark contrast to the typewriter keys she once knew. Above, the boots of German soldiers echoed through the streets, their voices barking orders in a language that still felt alien despite months of occupation. The invasion, Operation Sea Lion, had come swiftly after the Luftwaffe's triumph. By September 1940, German troops had landed on the southern coast, their panzers rolling through Kent as the Home Guard crumbled. Eleanor's brother, Tom, had been among the defenders at Dover, his fate unknown after the coastal batteries fell silent. She remembered his last letter, scrawled in haste: "Keep the fire burning, Ellie. They won't take our spirit." Now, as she listened to the distant rumble of artillery, she wondered if spirit alone could withstand the Reich's iron grip. Across the city, Oberst Hans Müller surveyed the occupation from a commandeered office in Whitehall. A career officer, Müller had seen the Blitzkrieg devour Poland and France, but Britain's fall was different. The island's defiance had been legendary, its people stubborn to a fault. Yet, as he gazed at the Union Jack lying crumpled in a corner, replaced by the swastika, he felt no triumph, only the weight of a new, uncertain order. His orders were clear: establish control, root out resistance, and prepare for the Führer's vision of a unified Europe. But the whispers of sabotage, of pamphlets circulating in the night, gnawed at his confidence. In New York, journalist Daniel Harper watched the newsreels with growing unease. The fall of Britain had shocked the world, but America remained on the sidelines, its leaders preaching isolation while the public debated intervention. Daniel's editor at the New York Times had sent him to London before the invasion, and his last dispatch, filed as German ships massed in the Channel, had warned of a world on the brink. Now, stranded in a neutral America, he penned columns urging action, even as Nazi diplomats negotiated a fragile peace with Washington. The world had shifted in ways none of them could have imagined. For Eleanor, it was the loss of her home, her freedom, and perhaps her brother. For Müller, it was the burden of enforcing a regime whose ideals he privately questioned. For Daniel, it was the realization that neutrality might condemn the world to darkness. As the swastika flew over Buckingham Palace, the question lingered: what would become of a world where Hitler's vision prevailed? Chapter 2: The Reich's Expansion. By the spring of 1941, Europe lay under the shadow of the swastika, its capitals transformed into outposts of the Third Reich's ambition. From the fjords of Norway to the vineyards of Bordeaux, German administrators imposed the Neue Ordnung, the new order, with ruthless efficiency. Puppet governments, staffed by collaborators and opportunists, enforced Berlin's decrees, while the Gestapo's black-clad agents rooted out dissent with a precision that chilled the soul. The fall of Britain had shattered the last bastion of Western resistance, and now the continent was being reshaped in Hitler's image. Eleanor Caldwell moved through the streets of occupied London like a ghost, her scarf pulled tight against the March wind. The city she once knew was unrecognizable. Piccadilly Circus, once ablaze with lights, now bore banners proclaiming Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. German soldiers patrolled Trafalgar Square, their rifles slung casually as if the city had always been theirs. Eleanor's resistance cell, a ragtag group of former soldiers, clerks, and housewives, met in the ruins of a bombed-out church in Bethnal Green. Their leader, a grizzled veteran named Arthur, had fought at Dunkirk and carried the scars, both visible and hidden, of that defeat. "We've got word from the Free French," Arthur whispered, his voice barely audible over the drip of rainwater through the church's shattered roof. "They're smuggling radios and explosives across the channel. If we can hit the railway hub at Clapham Junction, we'll disrupt their supply lines to the coast." Eleanor nodded, her heart pounding. The Sten gun she'd carried in Whitechapel was now a familiar weight, but the thought of sabotage, of facing the Gestapo's wrath, made her stomach churn. She thought of Tom, her brother, lost in the chaos of Dover's fall. Was he dead or worse, languishing in a labor camp? The uncertainty drove her forward, each act of defiance a tribute to his memory. In Vichy, Oberst Hans Müller stood in the opulent office of a former French prefect, now a collaborator's headquarters. The air smelled of wax polish and fear. Müller's role as a regional administrator in occupied France was to ensure compliance. Factories churned out tanks for the Wehrmacht, farms supplied grain to German cities, and the local population stayed docile. But the orders from Berlin were growing darker. The Endlösung, the final solution, had begun in earnest, with trains rolling eastward, their cargo human and their destination unspoken. Müller had seen the lists: Jews, Romani, political dissidents, all marked for relocation. He told himself it was logistics, not morality, that concerned him, but the lie grew harder to swallow. A report on his desk detailed resistance activity in Paris. A bombed bridge, a missing supply convoy. The culprits were elusive, their pamphlets taunting the occupiers with promises of liberation. Müller signed an order for reprisals. 10 civilians executed for every German casualty, but his hand hesitated over the paper. He remembered the faces in Warsaw, the hollow eyes of those herded onto trains. Was this the glory of the Reich? Across the Atlantic, Daniel Harper sat in a smoky Manhattan newsroom, his typewriter idle as he listened to a clandestine radio broadcast from Europe. The voice, distorted but defiant, spoke of resistance cells forming in France, Norway, and even Britain. Daniel's latest column for the New York Times had been censored, his warnings about Nazi ambitions deemed too provocative for a nation clinging to neutrality. President Lindbergh, elected on an isolationist platform, had signed a non-aggression pact with Berlin, trading access to American markets for promises of peace. But Daniel knew better. His sources, diplomats, exiles, and defectors, whispered of Nazi plans to dominate global trade, to turn Africa into a colonial fiefdom, to pressure Japan into a Pacific alliance. At a clandestine meeting in Brooklyn, Daniel met with Miriam Cohen, a Jewish refugee who had escaped France before the occupation tightened. Her stories of roundups in Paris, of families torn apart, fueled his resolve. "They're building camps, Daniel," she said, her voice trembling. "Not just for us, but for anyone who dares think differently. You have to tell the world." Daniel nodded, but the weight of America's apathy pressed down on him. His editor wanted stories of optimism, of prosperity in a world free of war. But Daniel saw only a world teetering on the edge, where silence was complicity. In London, Eleanor's cell prepared for their first major operation. Under cover of night, they slipped into the rail yard at Clapham Junction, planting explosives beneath a fuel depot. As they retreated, a German patrol spotted them and gunfire shattered the silence. Eleanor's heart raced as she fled through the alleys, Arthur's shout echoing in her ears. "Keep moving, Ellie." For Tom. The explosion lit up the sky behind them, a fleeting victory against the Reich's iron grip. But in Vichy, Muller received the report of the sabotage by dawn. His superiors demanded blood, and he knew the reprisals would be swift. As he signed the order for 50 executions, he wondered how long he could endure the cost of this new world. And in New York, Daniel typed his next column, defying censorship to tell Miriam's story, hoping to awaken a sleeping nation. The Reich's expansion was relentless, but so was the spark of resistance. The world was changing, and none of them, Eleanor, Muller, Daniel, could escape its pull. Chapter 3: The American Standoff. In the autumn of 1941, New York City buzzed with a nervous energy, its streets alive with the clatter of typewriters and the hum of radios broadcasting President Lindbergh's latest address. The United States, insulated by two oceans, had chosen neutrality over war, signing the Atlantic Accord with Nazi Germany in July. The agreement promised peace. No German U-boats would sink American ships, and in return, the U.S. would open its markets to German goods, flooding department stores with products stamped "Made in the Reich." But beneath the surface, the nation was fracturing, and Daniel Harper felt the fault lines widening with every story he chased. Daniel sat in a dimly lit Brooklyn diner, his notebook open beside a lukewarm coffee. Across from him, Miriam Cohen spoke in hushed tones, her eyes darting to the door as if expecting Gestapo agents to burst through. She had arrived in New York months earlier, smuggled out of France by a network of Jewish exiles. Her stories of Paris under occupation, of neighbors vanishing in the night, of synagogues burned, had shaken Daniel's faith in America's isolationist stance. "They're not stopping at Europe," Miriam said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "They're buying influence here, Daniel. Politicians, businessmen, they're all listening to Berlin's promises." Daniel scribbled notes, his pen scratching louder than he intended. His latest column for the New York Times had been spiked, deemed too inflammatory for a public weary of war. But Miriam's words confirmed his suspicions. The German-American Bund, a pro-Nazi organization, was gaining traction, its rallies drawing thousands in Madison Square Garden. Their rhetoric, cloaked in patriotism, praised Hitler's order and warned against foreign entanglements. Daniel had infiltrated one such rally, posing as a sympathizer, and seen congressmen shaking hands with Bund leaders. The memory made his stomach turn. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Eleanor Caldwell's resistance cell in London celebrated their Clapham Junction sabotage, but the cost was heavy. 2 members had been captured, their fates sealed by Gestapo interrogations. Eleanor hid in a safe house, a damp attic above a baker's shop, listening to BBC broadcasts smuggled through resistance channels. The news spoke of America's neutrality, a betrayal that stung as sharply as Britain's fall. "They're abandoning us," she muttered to Arthur, her cell's leader, as they pored over maps for their next target. Arthur's reply was grim. "We fight with or without them, Ellie." For Tom. In Vichy, Oberst Hans Muller received a coded message from Berlin. The Führer demanded increased production from French factories, and any resistance was to be crushed without mercy. Muller's days were a blur of reports and executions, each order chipping away at his resolve. A recent visit to a deportation center near Lyon had left him sleepless, the faces of children haunting his dreams. He wondered if the Reich's promises of glory were worth the blood they demanded. A letter from his wife in Munich urging him to stay safe lay unanswered on his desk. Back in New York, Daniel's investigation led him to a clandestine meeting in a Harlem basement, where anti-Nazi activists gathered. Among them was Samuel Wright, a labor organizer who had fought in the Spanish Civil War. Samuel's group was small but determined, smuggling funds and weapons to European resistance through Canadian ports. "The government won't act," Samuel said, his voice low. "But we can. If we don't, who will stop this spreading to our shores? Daniel agreed to help, using his press credentials to gather intelligence on Bund activities, though he knew the risk. Exposure could mean arrest or worse. One night, Daniel followed a lead to a Long Island estate, where a German diplomat met with American industrialists. Hidden in the shadows, he overheard plans to expand German influence through trade deals, with promises of cheap labor from occupied Europe. The diplomat's words were chilling. The Reich's vision is global. America will join us, willingly or otherwise. Daniel's camera clicked, capturing faces he recognized from Washington's elite. As he slipped away, a guard's flashlight swept the grounds, missing him by inches. In London, Eleanor's cell planned a daring raid on a German communications outpost, hoping to intercept messages about troop movements. The risk was immense, but so was the need for hope. In Vichy, Muller faced a choice: follow orders to execute a village suspected of hiding resistance fighters, or falsify a report to spare them. And in New York, Daniel's latest article, published in an underground paper, exposed the Bund's ties to Berlin, sparking outrage among readers but drawing the attention of FBI agents loyal to Lindbergh's regime. The Atlantic Accord held, but the standoff was fragile. America stood at a crossroads, and Daniel, Miriam, Samuel, Eleanor, and Muller were each caught in its currents, their choices shaping a world teetering between complicity and defiance. Chapter 4: The Eastern Front Stalemate. The winter of 1941–42 cast a brittle silence over the borderlands of Eastern Europe, where the Third Reich and the Soviet Union faced each other like wary predators. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, strained by mutual distrust, held just enough to prevent all-out war, but the frontier from the Baltic to the Black Sea bristled with fortifications, watchtowers, and the distant rumble of artillery. Both sides knew peace was a fiction, sustained only by the Reich's preoccupation with consolidating Europe and Stalin's cautious rebuilding of his purged Red Army. In the shadows of this stalemate, proxy wars flared, and espionage wove a deadly web. In London, Eleanor Caldwell huddled in the attic safe house, the air thick with the scent of stale bread and fear. Her resistance cell's success at Clapham Junction had emboldened them, but the Gestapo's reprisals were merciless. 50 civilians shot in Trafalgar Square, their bodies left as a warning. Arthur, the cell's leader, had received a crate of Soviet-made rifles smuggled through neutral Ireland, a gift from shadowy contacts promising support. "The Reds want a foothold," Arthur muttered, inspecting a Mosin-Nagant's worn stock. "They're using us to poke the Nazis, but can we trust them?" Eleanor's hands tightened around her Sten gun. The idea of Soviet aid was a bitter pill. Her brother Tom had despised communists as much as fascists, but survival demanded pragmatism. Their next target was a German radio tower in Kent, relaying orders to U-boats in the Atlantic. Disrupting it could weaken the Reich's grip on the seas, but the mission meant crossing a countryside crawling with patrols. "For Tom," she whispered, steeling herself for the night ahead. In Vichy, Oberst Hans Muller found himself drawn into the murky world of espionage. Berlin's orders were clear: monitor Soviet movements along the eastern border, where skirmishes in Poland and Ukraine hinted at Stalin's ambitions. Muller's new liaison, a cold-eyed Abwehr agent named Klaus, delivered a dossier of intercepted Soviet communications. The pages detailed Red Army troop movements and whispers of partisan activity in the occupied Baltic states. "The Führer believes the Bolsheviks are testing us," Klaus said, his voice clipped. "Find their spies, Muller. Crush them." Muller nodded, but the task unsettled him. He had been trained to command troops, not chase phantoms. A recent incident in Warsaw, a German convoy ambushed by partisans armed with Soviet explosives, had led to a brutal crackdown with entire villages razed. Muller had overseen the operation, his signature on the orders, but the screams of civilians echoed in his mind. Now, tasked with rooting out Soviet agents in France, he wondered if the Reich's enemies were as numerous within its ranks as without. A cryptic note slipped under his door, warning of a traitor in Vichy, only deepened his unease. Across the Atlantic, Daniel Harper's investigation into Nazi influence in America had taken a dangerous turn. His underground article exposing the German-American Bund's ties to Berlin had sparked protests in New York, but it also drew the attention of the FBI, loyal to President Lindbergh's isolationist regime. Daniel met Miriam Cohen and Samuel Wright in a Chicago safe house, where they pored over smuggled intelligence from Europe. A contact in Canada had relayed news of Soviet support for resistance groups, including Eleanor's cell in London. "Stalin's playing a long game," Samuel said, his voice grim. "He's arming anyone who'll fight the Nazis, but he's no friend to freedom." Daniel's latest lead pointed to a German diplomat in Washington, orchestrating propaganda through American radio stations. Posing as a freelance reporter, he secured an interview, only to overhear a conversation about a Soviet spy ring operating in Berlin. The information was explosive. If true, it could destabilize the Reich's Eastern Front. But sharing it risked exposing his network, and Daniel knew the FBI was watching his every move. As he typed a coded message to Samuel, a car idled outside the safe house, its headlights casting long shadows. In the Balkans, the stalemate erupted into chaos. Partisans in Yugoslavia, armed with Soviet weapons, ambushed a German supply line, drawing Muller's attention. He traveled to Belgrade, where the streets were a battleground of ideologies. Communist partisans, royalist Chetniks, and Nazi enforcers clashing in a proxy war. Muller interrogated a captured partisan, a young woman whose defiance mirrored Eleanor's. "You can't hold us forever," she spat, her words haunting him as he signed her death warrant. In Kent, Eleanor's cell struck the radio tower under cover of darkness, their explosives toppling the structure in a blaze of sparks. But the victory was costly. Arthur was wounded and the Gestapo closed in. As they fled through the woods, Eleanor clutched a Soviet radio, its static-filled voice promising more aid. In Vichy, Muller discovered the traitor's identity, a fellow officer leaking intelligence to Moscow, and faced a choice: report him or use him to feed false information. And in Chicago, Daniel's message reached Samuel, setting in motion a plan to smuggle the Soviet spy ring's details to European resistance. The Eastern Front held, but the stalemate was a tinderbox. Eleanor, Muller, and Daniel, each bound by their choices, stood at the edge of a world where every spark could ignite a firestorm. Chapter 5. The Aryan Utopia. By 1955, the Third Reich's vision had hardened into a suffocating reality across Europe. The Neue Ordnung was no longer just a political framework but a cultural monolith, reshaping art, literature, and thought to fit the Nazi ideal of an Aryan utopia. In cities from Berlin to Paris, grand boulevards bore the names of fallen SS heroes, their statues towering over squares where dissent had been crushed. Theaters played only approved films glorifying the Führer's triumphs, while libraries purged books deemed degenerate, works by Jews, communists, or anyone who dared imagine a world beyond the swastika. Yet beneath this polished facade, resistance smoldered, and the human spirit refused to be extinguished. In London, Eleanor Caldwell navigated a city transformed. The once vibrant streets of Soho were now a sterile grid of Reich-approved shops, their signs in Gothic script proclaiming "Erasure Qualitat." The resistance cell she belonged to had dwindled, battered by years of Gestapo raids, but Eleanor's resolve held firm. Arthur, their leader, had succumbed to his wounds after the Kent radio tower sabotage, leaving her to guide the remnants. Now, in a hidden basement beneath a shuttered bookstore, she sorted through a crate of banned novels, Orwell, Hemingway, Kafka, smuggled from neutral Switzerland. "These are our weapons now," she told her comrades, her voice steady despite the ache of loss. "They can't erase our minds." The cell's new mission was to distribute these books, slipping them into schools and factories to remind people of a world before the Reich. Each pamphlet, each page was a risk. Discovery meant death or worse. Eleanor thought of Tom, her brother, whose fate remained a mystery. A rumor had reached her through resistance channels. He might be alive, a prisoner in a labor camp in Poland. The hope was a double-edged sword, driving her to act but piercing her with fear. In Berlin, Oberst Hans Müller stood in the shadow of the Volksschau, the colossal dome Hitler had envisioned as the heart of his empire. Now completed, it hosted rallies where thousands chanted slogans of racial purity and eternal victory. Müller, promoted to a staff position in the Reich Ministry of Culture, was tasked with enforcing the ban on degenerate art. Paintings by Picasso and Chagall were burned in public squares, replaced by heroic portraits of blonde soldiers and idyllic landscapes. The work left Müller hollow. He had joined the Wehrmacht for duty, not fanaticism, but the line between the two had blurred. At a rally, a young SS officer's speech, proclaiming the eradication of inferior cultures, made Müller's skin crawl. He excused himself, claiming a headache, and retreated to his office, where a hidden copy of Goethe's Faust lay buried in a drawer, a quiet rebellion against the Reich's dogma. Across the Atlantic, Daniel Harper had become a ghost in his own country. His exposés on the German-American Bund had forced him underground, his name blacklisted by Lindbergh's government. Now operating out of a safe house in Boston, he worked with Miriam Cohen and Samuel Wright to publish an underground newspaper, The Beacon, smuggled to Europe via Canada. Their latest issue detailed the Reich's cultural purge, drawing on accounts from exiles and defectors. "They're not just killing people," Miriam said, her eyes fierce as she proofread a story. "They're killing ideas, history, everything that makes us human." Daniel nodded, his fingers stained with ink. His latest scoop, a leaked memo about Nazi plans to re-educate American youth, had sparked outrage among their readers, but FBI raids were closing in. In occupied Paris, the cultural erasure was stark. The Louvre, stripped of unacceptable works, now displayed propaganda art, its halls patrolled by SS guards. Eleanor's resistance network had contacts in the city, and a smuggled message brought hope. A French cell planned to sabotage a Reich exhibition showcasing the Aryan ideal. Eleanor volunteered to cross the Channel, a perilous journey through U-boat-infested waters, to coordinate the effort. The mission was a long shot, but the thought of striking at the heart of Nazi propaganda fueled her. Müller, meanwhile, faced a crisis of conscience. A subordinate had discovered his copy of Faust, and whispers of disloyalty reached the Gestapo. To prove his allegiance, he was ordered to oversee the destruction of a university library in Prague, its shelves filled with banned texts. As he stood amid the burning books, the acrid smoke stung his eyes, and he wondered if he could still claim to be a soldier, not a monster. A chance encounter with a resistance courier carrying a copy of The Beacon planted a dangerous idea. What if he could help, even in secret? In Boston, Daniel's network uncovered a Nazi plot to infiltrate American universities, funding professors to spread pro-Reich ideology. He and Samuel planned a risky operation to expose the scheme, planting evidence in a diplomat's office. But as they moved, the FBI tightened its net, and Miriam warned of a mole in their ranks. Across the Channel, Eleanor reached Paris, her heart pounding as she met the French resistance. The exhibition sabotage was set, but a traitor lurked, threatening to unravel everything. The Aryan utopia was a lie, built on fear and erasure, but its cracks were growing. Eleanor, Müller, and Daniel, each in their own way, carried the weight of defiance, their actions a fragile hope against the Reich's suffocating grip. Chapter 6. The Resistance. In the autumn of 1955, the resistance in occupied Europe burned brighter, a fragile flame against the Reich's iron grip. From the catacombs of Paris to the forests of Norway, small bands of fighters struck at the edges of Nazi control, their acts of defiance whispered in hushed tones by those who dared to hope. But each victory came at a cost, and the Gestapo's shadow loomed larger with every blow. In France, Eleanor Caldwell's resistance cell prepared for their most audacious operation yet. sabotaging a deportation train bound for the camps in the east, carrying hundreds to an unspeakable fate. Eleanor stood in a damp cellar beneath a Parisian café, the air thick with the scent of mildew and gunpowder. She had crossed the Channel weeks earlier, a perilous journey through U-boat-infested waters, to join forces with the French resistance. The cell's leader, a wiry woman named Claire with scars crisscrossing her hands, outlined the plan on a tattered map. "The train leaves Drancy at midnight," Claire said, her voice low. "It's carrying Jews, Romani, and political prisoners. We hit the tracks near Compiègne, plant the charges, and get out before the SS responds." Eleanor's heart raced as she checked her explosives, crude but effective devices smuggled from Swiss contacts. The memory of Tom, her brother, possibly alive in a Polish camp, drove her forward. But doubt gnawed at her. Their cell had been betrayed before. Arthur's death after the Kent sabotage was proof, and Claire's newest recruit, a quiet man named Julian, seemed too eager, his questions too probing. "We trust him," Claire insisted, but Eleanor's instincts screamed otherwise. In Berlin, Oberst Hans Müller wrestled with his own betrayal. The discovery of his hidden copy of Faust had sparked suspicion, and now the Gestapo watched his every move. His role in the Reich Ministry of Culture grew unbearable, each day spent approving propaganda or ordering the destruction of degenerate works. A recent assignment had sent him to Prague, where he oversaw the burning of a university library. The flames had seared his conscience, and the resistance courier's copy of the Beacon, Daniel Harper's underground newspaper, burned a hole in his pocket. The paper's latest issue detailed a planned sabotage in France, and Müller faced a choice: report it to save himself or let it pass, risking everything. Across the Atlantic, Daniel Harper had crossed into occupied Europe, smuggled through Canada to join the resistance's propaganda efforts. Now in Amsterdam, he worked with a Dutch printer to distribute the Beacon, its pages exposing Nazi atrocities and rallying support. His latest article detailed the deportation trains, drawing on Miriam Cohen's smuggled diary entries from Paris. "They're not just killing us," Miriam had written, "they're erasing our stories." Daniel's mission was to ensure those stories were heard, but the work was dangerous. Gestapo raids had shut down 2 printing presses, and Daniel's forged papers wouldn't hold up under scrutiny. In Paris, the night of the sabotage arrived. Eleanor, Claire, and their cell crept through the woods near Compiègne, the distant rumble of the train growing louder. They planted the charges, their hands steady despite the cold. As the explosives detonated, the train screeched to a halt, its cars derailing in a chaos of metal and fire. Prisoners spilled out, some fleeing into the night, others too weak to run. Eleanor's heart soared, until gunfire erupted. The SS had been tipped off, and Julian was nowhere to be seen. The ambush was brutal. Claire fell, her blood soaking the forest floor, and Eleanor barely escaped, dragging a wounded comrade to safety. The betrayal confirmed her fears. Julian was a Gestapo plant. In Berlin, Müller learned of the failed sabotage through a Gestapo report, the details matching the Beacon's account. He realized the resistance's plan had been compromised, and his silence had done nothing to stop the bloodshed. Guilt gnawed at him, but a new resolve took root. He would feed false information to the Gestapo, a small act of defiance that might buy the resistance time. In Amsterdam, Daniel received word of the Compiègne disaster through resistance channels. The loss shook him, but Miriam's latest message, smuggled from Paris, urged him to keep publishing. "They can't silence us all," she wrote. Daniel worked through the night, printing a new edition of the Beacon that exposed the betrayal and honored the fallen. As he slipped copies into the hands of couriers, he heard rumors of an American shift, whispers of covert aid to the resistance, sparked by his earlier exposés. Eleanor, hiding in a Parisian safe house, mourned Claire but refused to break. The escaped prisoners were a victory, however small, and word of Tom's survival grew stronger, fueling her fight. Müller, in Berlin, slipped a coded message to a resistance contact, risking his life. And Daniel, in Amsterdam, prepared to move to London, where Eleanor's cell needed his skills. The resistance was battered but unbroken, a flicker of hope in a world suffocating under the Reich's weight. Chapter 7: The Global Reach. By 1955, the Third Reich's ambitions stretched far beyond Europe's borders, casting a long shadow over Africa and the Middle East. With Western Europe subdued and the Soviet Union locked in a tense stalemate, Nazi Germany turned its gaze to the global south, seeking resources to fuel its war machine and allies to bolster its ideology. From the gold mines of South Africa to the oil fields of Persia, the Reich's influence spread through a mix of coercion, commerce, and propaganda, forging a world where the swastika flew alongside local flags. Yet, in the cracks of this empire, resistance stirred, connecting far-flung rebels to the fight in Europe. Eleanor Caldwell, now a seasoned resistance fighter, had returned to London after the disastrous Campaign sabotage. The betrayal by Julian and the loss of Claire weighed heavily, but news of Tom's possible survival in a Polish camp kept her moving. In a cramped safe house near the Thames, she met with a new contact, Aisha, a Moroccan courier who had slipped into Britain via Gibraltar. Aisha brought word of resistance in North Africa, where Berber tribes and urban intellectuals sabotaged Nazi-controlled ports. "The Reich is bleeding us dry," Aisha said, her voice sharp. "They take our phosphate, our labor, but we're fighting back and we need your help." Eleanor's cell, battered but resilient, saw an opportunity. Aisha proposed a coordinated strike. European resistance would hit Nazi supply lines while African cells disrupted shipments of raw materials. The plan required smuggling explosives to Casablanca, a mission that meant crossing Reich-patrolled waters. Eleanor volunteered, driven by the hope that global resistance could weaken the regime enough to find Tom. As she prepared, she clutched a worn photograph of her brother, his smile a reminder of the world they'd lost. In Berlin, Oberst Hans Muller's descent into moral turmoil deepened. His secret act of defiance, passing false information to the Gestapo about the Campaign sabotage, had gone undetected, but the strain was unbearable. Now reassigned to oversee economic operations in the Reich's African territories, Muller traveled to Tripoli, where German companies extracted oil under the guise of development. The city was a facade of order. German engineers in crisp uniforms oversaw sprawling refineries, while local workers toiled under brutal conditions. Muller met with a Vichy-aligned Libyan governor, whose obsequious loyalty to Berlin masked a simmering resentment. A report crossed Muller's desk. Resistance attacks on Saharan pipelines were costing the Reich millions. He buried the report, a small rebellion that felt increasingly futile. In Amsterdam, Daniel Harper's work with the Beacon had made him a target. The underground newspaper, now circulating in Europe and beyond, exposed the Reich's exploitation of African and Middle Eastern resources. Daniel's latest article, based on Aisha's accounts, detailed forced labor in Algerian mines and Nazi alliances with Persian elites. Smuggled to Cairo, the article inspired student protests, which the SS brutally suppressed. Daniel, hiding in a Dutch attic, received a coded message from Miriam Cohen in Paris. "The world is watching. Keep writing." But the Gestapo was closing in, and Daniel's forged papers were wearing thin. In North Africa, the Reich's grip tightened. German advisors propped up puppet regimes in Egypt and Algeria, while propaganda glorified the Aryan mission to civilize the continent. In the Middle East, Berlin courted authoritarian leaders, offering weapons for oil and loyalty. Daniel's network connected with a Syrian resistance group, who shared intelligence about Nazi plans to control the Suez Canal. The information was explosive, but delivering it to Eleanor's cell meant crossing borders patrolled by the SS and their local allies. Eleanor's journey to Casablanca was fraught with danger. Disguised as a French merchant, she boarded a fishing boat, its hold packed with explosives. Storms and U-boat patrols tested her nerve, but Aisha's contacts guided her to a Moroccan safe house. There she met resistance fighters planning to bomb a Nazi phosphate mine. The operation was a success, the explosion echoing across the desert, but SS reprisals were swift, razing nearby villages. Eleanor's heart sank as she witnessed the cost, yet Aisha's words stayed with her. Every strike weakens them. In Tripoli, Muller faced a reckoning. A resistance attack on a refinery, linked to Aisha's network, forced him to order a crackdown. As he signed the orders, a memory of the Prague library fire haunted him. He slipped a warning to a local contact, hoping to spare civilians, but the Gestapo's suspicions grew. A late-night summons to Berlin loomed, and Muller feared his double life was unraveling. In Amsterdam, Daniel's latest Beacon issue, smuggled to London, reached Eleanor's cell. It detailed the African resistance linking their fight to Europe's. Inspired, Eleanor planned a new sabotage in Britain, targeting a port shipping African resources. But as Daniel prepared to join her in London, a Gestapo raid forced him to flee, leaving behind a half-printed issue. In Paris, Miriam's diary entries, smuggled to Daniel, painted a grim picture of the camps, urging the world to act. The Reich's global reach was vast, but resistance was a wildfire, spreading from London to Casablanca to Damascus. Eleanor, Muller, and Daniel, each scarred by their choices, fought in their own ways, their actions a fragile thread binding a world desperate for freedom. Chapter 8: The Human Cost. In the winter of 1955, the Third Reich's machinery of death operated with chilling efficiency, its reach extending from the frozen plains of Poland to the deserts of North Africa. The Endlösung, the final solution, had grown into a monstrous enterprise with deportation trains rumbling day and night, carrying millions to labor camps, death camps, and unmarked graves. The world knew, through whispers and smuggled reports, of the horrors unfolding in the East, but fear and complicity silenced most. Yet for those who bore witness, the human cost was a wound that bled into every act of defiance, every moment of doubt. Miriam Cohen hid in a cramped attic above a Paris tailor's shop, her diary a lifeline in a city suffocated by the Reich. By candlelight, she scrawled accounts of the roundups she'd witnessed, families torn apart, children crying as SS officers herded them onto trains at Drancy. Her words were raw, unfiltered, a testament to the lives erased. "They took Madame Levy today," she wrote, her hand trembling. "Her bakery was empty by noon, the ovens cold. They say she's gone to Auschwitz, but no one returns from there." Miriam's diary, smuggled to resistance networks, had reached Daniel Harper's The Beacon, its pages fueling outrage among those who dared to read it. But each entry risked her life. The Gestapo was hunting diarists, branding them enemies of the state. In London, Eleanor Caldwell returned from Casablanca, her mission to sabotage a Nazi phosphate mine a fleeting victory overshadowed by the Reich's reprisals. Villages had been razed, their inhabitants shot or deported. The weight of those losses pressed on her, mingling with the hope of Tom's survival in a Polish camp. In a safe house near the docks, she met with Aisha, the Moroccan courier, who brought news of a new resistance network linking Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. "We're not alone," Aisha said, her eyes fierce. "But the camps, they're worse than we imagined. We need to hit them directly." Eleanor agreed, proposing a plan to disrupt a train route to Treblinka, a mission that meant infiltrating Poland itself. In Berlin, Oberst Hans Muller's world was unraveling. His covert aid to the resistance, slipping false reports to the Gestapo, had saved lives but drawn suspicion. A summons to the Reichssicherheitsamt, the SS security headquarters, loomed like a guillotine. Muller's latest assignment was to inspect a labor camp near Warsaw, part of the Reich's general plan Ost to resettle Eastern Europe. The camp was a hellscape. Skeletal figures toiled under barbed wire, their eyes hollow with despair. Muller recognized a face among the prisoners, a professor he'd met in Prague whose library he'd burned. The man's gaze held no accusation, only resignation, and Muller turned away, sickened. That night, he slipped a coded message to a resistance contact, detailing the camp's layout, a betrayal that could cost him everything. In Amsterdam, Daniel Harper's work with the beacon had become a beacon of truth in a world drowned in lies. Miriam's diary entries, smuggled through resistance channels, formed the heart of his latest issue, exposing the camp's horrors to a global audience. But the Gestapo's raids were relentless, and Daniel's safe house was compromised. Fleeing to Rotterdam, he met a Polish exile, Jakub, who had escaped Treblinka. Jakub's stories, gas chambers, mass graves, children used as labor, shook Daniel to his core. "You write about us," Jakub said, his voice breaking. "But who will save us?" Daniel vowed to try, sending Jakub's account to resistance networks in London, where Eleanor's cell was planning their next move. In Paris, Miriam's hiding place grew precarious. A neighbor's suspicion led to a Gestapo search, and she fled to a new safe house, her diary hidden in her coat. Her latest entry described a young boy, barely 10, taken from Drancy. He clutched a toy train as if it could carry him home. The image haunted her, fueling her resolve to keep writing. In Poland, Eleanor's cell infiltrated a rail hub near Warsaw, planting explosives to derail a deportation train. The blast freed dozens of prisoners, but SS reinforcements arrived, and Eleanor barely escaped, her comrade wounded. The mission's success was bittersweet, the freed prisoners scattering into a countryside crawling with patrols. In Berlin, Muller's coded message reached Eleanor's network, providing critical intelligence for their next operation. But a Gestapo officer confronted him, accusing him of disloyalty. Muller's denial was weak, and he knew his time was running out. In Rotterdam, Daniel published Jakub's story, sparking protests in neutral countries, but an SS informant tracked him, forcing another desperate flight. Miriam, in Paris, wrote her final entry before fleeing again. "If I die, let my words live." The human cost of the Reich's empire was incalculable, but Miriam's diary, Eleanor's defiance, Muller's betrayal, and Daniel's words kept the fight alive. Each act, however small, was a refusal to let the world forget. Chapter 9. Internal Struggles. In the autumn of 1953, the Third Reich trembled on the edge of chaos. Adolf Hitler's death, officially attributed to a heart attack, though rumors of poison swirled, had left a void that no single man could fill. The Volkschau's grand halls, once echoing with the Führer's voice, now rang with the whispered ambitions of his successors. Heinrich Himmler, the cold architect of the SS, and Hermann Göring, the flamboyant Luftwaffe chief, vied for control, their factions splintering the regime's unity. As Berlin's elite turned inward, the cracks in the Reich's facade offered a glimmer of hope to those fighting its tyranny. Oberst Hans Müller stood at a crossroads. His covert aid to the resistance, leaking intelligence about camps and supply lines, had gone undetected, but the Gestapo's suspicions had grown into a noose. Back in Berlin after his stint in Tripoli, Müller was summoned to a clandestine meeting in the Reichssicherheitsamt. There, an SS officer, his eyes like flint, accused him of negligence in the African operations. "The resistance grows bolder," the officer snapped, tossing a copy of the beacon onto the table, its pages detailing Müller's buried report on the Saharan pipeline attacks. "Are you loyal, Oberst, or are you a traitor?" Müller's denial was steady, but his heart pounded. That night, he slipped a new message to a resistance contact, detailing Himmler's plans to purge Göring's allies, a desperate bid to prove his worth to the underground. In London, Eleanor Caldwell's resistance cell reeled from the losses in Poland. The Treblinka sabotage had freed prisoners, but the cost was steep. 2 comrades captured, their fates sealed. Eleanor clung to the rumor of her brother Tom's survival, a fragile hope that fueled her. In a safe house near the ruined St. Paul's Cathedral, she met Aisha, the Moroccan courier who brought news of global resistance networks linking Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. "The Reich is fighting itself," Aisha said, her voice urgent. "Himmler and Göring's feud is our chance." Eleanor proposed a new mission: infiltrate a Berlin propaganda office to steal documents exposing the regime's infighting, a move that could embolden resistance across the continent. The journey to Germany was a death wish, but Eleanor volunteered, driven by Tom's memory and the need to strike at the Reich's heart. In Rotterdam, Daniel Harper's work with the Beacon had made him a marked man. His exposés, fueled by Miriam Cohen's diary and Jakob's accounts from Treblinka, had reached neutral countries, sparking protests in Sweden and Switzerland. But the Gestapo's net was tightening, and Daniel's latest safe house was raided, forcing him to flee to Brussels. There he met a defector from Göring's camp, a Luftwaffe officer named Karl, who offered intelligence on the power struggle. "Himmler wants total control," Karl whispered, his hands shaking. "He's planning a coup and Göring's too drunk on power to see it." Daniel saw an opportunity. Publishing Karl's revelations could destabilize the Reich further. But the risk was immense. Karl's information came with a price, and Daniel's network was stretched thin. In Berlin, Müller navigated a city electric with tension. SS and Wehrmacht officers eyed each other warily, their loyalty to Himmler or Göring dividing old alliances. Müller's message to the resistance had reached Eleanor's network, and he received a coded reply: a plan to sabotage a propaganda office during a Himmler-led rally. The audacity stunned him, but he agreed to provide blueprints, knowing exposure would mean a firing squad. His visits to the Warsaw camp haunted him, the professor's empty gaze a mirror to his own guilt. "I am no better than them," he wrote in a private journal hidden beneath a floorboard. Yet each act of defiance chipped away at that guilt, a fragile redemption. Eleanor's journey to Berlin was a gauntlet of checkpoints and forged papers. Disguised as a German typist, she infiltrated the propaganda office, her heart pounding as she copied documents detailing Himmler's purges. The papers confirmed Aisha's intel. The Reich was fracturing, its leaders consumed by ambition. But a careless glance from an SS guard raised suspicion, and Eleanor fled, the documents tucked inside her coat. In Brussels, Daniel published Karl's revelations in the Beacon, the article spreading like wildfire. Protests erupted in occupied cities, and even some Wehrmacht officers whispered of defection. But the Gestapo traced the leak to Brussels, and Daniel's network faced a traitor within. In Paris, Miriam Cohen, still hiding, learned of Eleanor's mission through resistance channels. Her diary, now a symbol of defiance, was smuggled to Daniel, its latest entries detailing the camp's horrors with unflinching clarity. "They cannot erase us," she wrote, "not while we remember." As Eleanor escaped Berlin, Müller faced a Gestapo interrogation, his lies barely holding. Daniel, in Brussels, prepared to move to London, where Eleanor's stolen documents could ignite a broader rebellion. The Reich's internal struggles were a chink in its armor, and the resistance, through Eleanor's courage, Müller's betrayal, and Daniel's words, aimed to widen it. Chapter 10: The Soviet Shadow. By late 1955, the uneasy truce between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union had frayed into a shadow war, fought not on open battlefields but in the muddy hills of the Balkans and the back alleys of Eastern Europe. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a fragile relic of 1939, held only by mutual fear of annihilation, but proxy conflicts in Poland, Ukraine, and Yugoslavia tested its limits. Soviet arms flowed to partisan groups, while the Reich's SS crushed dissent with increasing desperation. Amid this cold stalemate, the resistance found both opportunity and peril, as Soviet aid came with strings that threatened to unravel their fragile unity. In London, Eleanor Caldwell grappled with the fallout of her Berlin mission. The stolen documents exposing Himmler's purges of Göring's allies had ignited resistance networks across Europe, but the cost was steep. 2 comrades had been captured during her escape, their fates unknown, and the Gestapo's hunt for her intensified. In a safe house near the bombed-out remains of Covent Garden, Eleanor met with Aisha and a new contact, Ivan, a Soviet operative posing as a Polish exile. Ivan offered a cache of explosives and radios, smuggled through Finland, to strike a Nazi munitions depot in Warsaw. "The Kremlin wants the Reich bled dry," Ivan said, his accent clipped. "But you must move fast." Eleanor hesitated. Soviet aid had saved her cell before, but Ivan's cold pragmatism echoed Julian's betrayal in Compiègne. The rumor of her brother Tom's survival in a Polish camp drove her to accept, but distrust gnawed at her. "We take the weapons," she told Aisha, "but we watch him." The Warsaw mission meant returning to Poland, a journey through a Reich-controlled heartland where every checkpoint was a gamble. For Tom, she thought, clutching his photograph, she would risk it all. In Berlin, Oberst Hans Müller teetered on the edge of ruin. His coded messages to the resistance, detailing camp layouts and Himmler's plans, had saved lives, but the Gestapo's net was closing. A new assignment tasked him with uncovering Soviet spies within the Reich's Eastern administration, a role that forced him to confront his own duplicity. In Warsaw, Müller interrogated a captured partisan, a young Ukrainian woman named Alina, who admitted to receiving Soviet arms. Her defiance, reminiscent of the Prague professors, shook him. "You think you've won," she spat, "but your empire is rotting." Müller released her, falsifying a report to claim she died, but the act pushed him closer to exposure. A Gestapo officer, suspicious of his loyalty, shadowed his every move. In Brussels, Daniel Harper's The Beacon continued to light fires of dissent. His publication of the Berlin documents had sparked protests in neutral countries and whispers of defection among Wehrmacht officers. Now hiding in a Belgian safe house, Daniel received Miriam Cohen's latest diary entries, smuggled from Paris, detailing the camp's horrors. He also learned of Eleanor's Warsaw plan through resistance channels. Determined to amplify their efforts, Daniel proposed a new Beacon issue exposing Soviet Nazi proxy wars, hoping to pressure neutral nations to act. But a traitor in his network, possibly the same mole who betrayed his Amsterdam safe house, forced him to relocate again, this time to Copenhagen. In the Balkans, the Soviet shadow loomed large. Yugoslav partisans, armed with Red Army rifles, ambushed SS convoys, while Nazi reprisals leveled villages. Müller, sent to Belgrade to assess the situation, witnessed the carnage. Burned homes, executed civilians, and a growing hatred for the Reich. A resistance courier slipped him a message from Eleanor's cell, requesting intelligence on the Warsaw depot. Müller provided it, knowing the Gestapo's suspicions were mounting. In London, Eleanor's cell prepared for the Warsaw mission, but Ivan's insistence on leading the operation raised red flags. Aisha warned of Soviet ambitions to control the resistance, and Eleanor faced a choice: trust Ivan or risk the mission's collapse. In Copenhagen, Daniel's latest Beacon issue, detailing the Balkan proxy wars and Miriam's diary, reached Sweden, where diplomats began quietly funding resistance groups. But a Gestapo raid forced Daniel to flee again, his papers barely holding under scrutiny. In Warsaw, Eleanor's cell struck the munitions depot, the explosion lighting up the night and freeing a handful of prisoners, including a man who claimed to know Tom. The mission succeeded, but Ivan's sudden disappearance confirmed Eleanor's fears. He had been siphoning intelligence to Moscow. In Berlin, Müller faced a final Gestapo interrogation, his lies unraveling as evidence of his resistance ties surfaced. The Soviet shadow cast a complex web, empowering the resistance but threatening its autonomy. Eleanor's hope for Tom, Müller's fragile redemption, and Daniel's relentless truth-telling held the line against a Reich teetering on the brink, but each step forward came at a greater cost. Chapter 11. The American Awakening. By the winter of 1955-56, the United States stood at a crossroads, its isolationist facade cracking under the weight of truth. Daniel Harper's underground newspaper, The Beacon, had pierced America's apathy with accounts of Nazi atrocities, Soviet-Nazi proxy wars, and the resistance's desperate fight. Smuggled copies, distributed through Canada and neutral ports, reached American readers, sparking protests in cities from Boston to Chicago. The Atlantic Accord, binding the U.S. to neutrality with Nazi Germany, began to fray as public outrage grew, and whispers of covert aid to European resistance reached the ears of those willing to act. Daniel Harper arrived in London under a moonless sky, his forged papers barely passing a Gestapo checkpoint at Dover. After months on the run, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Copenhagen, he was exhausted, his body lean from hunger and fear. In a safe house near the shattered remains of the East End, he reunited with Eleanor Caldwell, whose face, hardened by years of resistance, softened briefly at the sight of him. "You're here," she said, her voice catching. "Your words, they're reaching people, Daniel." The stolen Berlin documents exposing Himmler's purges had fueled the Beacon's latest issue, and Eleanor's cell was planning a new strike based on Muller's intelligence, sabotaging a Reich propaganda broadcast to Europe. Eleanor briefed Daniel on the plan. The BBC's old studios, now a Nazi propaganda hub, were broadcasting lies to occupied territories. Disrupting it could amplify the Beacon's message, sowing dissent across the Reich. Daniel, with his journalism skills, would craft a counter-broadcast, using Miriam Cohen's diary and resistance reports to expose the regime's weaknesses. But the mission was fraught. The studio was heavily guarded, and Ivan's betrayal in Warsaw had left Eleanor wary of leaks. "We trust no one we don't know," she told Daniel, her eyes scanning the room for signs of betrayal. In Berlin, Oberst Hans Muller's double life was crumbling. His coded messages to the resistance, camp layouts, Himmler's plans, Warsaw Depot details, had saved lives but drawn the Gestapo's wrath. A late-night interrogation in the Reichssicherheitsstaat had left him shaken. The SS officer, clutching a dossier of Muller's movements, accused him of treason. "You've been careless, Oberst," the officer sneered, holding up a smudged copy of the Beacon. Muller's heart sank. His leaks had reached the resistance, but they'd also reached his enemies. To buy time, he fabricated a story of infiltrating resistance networks, but the lie felt thin. That night, he slipped a final message to a courier, detailing the propaganda studio's security, knowing it might be his last act. Across the Atlantic, the American awakening gained momentum. Daniel's exposés, smuggled through Sweden, had reached U.S. senators opposed to Lindbergh's regime. In a clandestine Washington meeting, a naval officer, Captain Reynolds, agreed to funnel weapons to European resistance through Canadian ports. "Your paper's changing minds," Reynolds told a contact linked to Daniel's network. "But Lindbergh's men are watching." Protests in New York, sparked by the Beacon's accounts of the camps and proxy wars, clashed with German-American Bund rallies, and the FBI tightened its grip on suspected dissidents. Miriam Cohen's diary, now a cornerstone of the Beacon, fueled the outrage, her words a haunting call to action. In London, Eleanor and Daniel prepared for the studio sabotage. Disguised as technicians, they infiltrated the BBC building, their explosives hidden in equipment bags. Daniel worked feverishly, recording a broadcast that wove Miriam's diary with accounts of Himmler's purges and African resistance. As the charges were set, a guard's suspicion forced a hasty retreat, the explosion rocking the studio just as Daniel's broadcast aired, its signal hijacking Reich airwaves. The message reached millions, a fleeting cry of defiance before the SS regained control. In Berlin, Muller learned of the broadcast through a panicked Gestapo report. His intelligence had made it possible, but the SS traced the leak to him. Arrested at dawn, he faced a choice: confess and die or name resistance contacts to save himself. In London, Eleanor and Daniel escaped the studio raid, but a traitor's tip led to Aisha's capture, shattering their cell. In Washington, Reynolds smuggled a shipment of rifles to Europe, inspired by the Beacon, but FBI agents closed in on Daniel's U.S. contacts. The American awakening was a spark, fanned by Daniel's words, Eleanor's courage, and Muller's sacrifice. The Reich's grip tightened, but the resistance's voice grew louder, echoing across a world stirring from its slumber. Chapter 12. The Spark of Rebellion. In the spring of 1956, a spark ignited across occupied Europe, a rebellion born of desperation and defiance. From the cobbled streets of Paris to the forests of Poland, resistance cells, emboldened by Eleanor Caldwell's stolen Berlin documents and Daniel Harper's The Beacon, launched a coordinated uprising against the Third Reich. The stolen intelligence, exposing Himmler's purges and the regime's fractures, had spread like wildfire, while the Beacon's broadcasts and smuggled papers rallied the oppressed. But the Reich's response was swift and brutal, and for those who fought, the line between hope and sacrifice blurred. In London, Eleanor Caldwell stood at the heart of the uprising's planning. The BBC studio Sabotage had sent a message, its hijacked broadcast echoing Miriam Cohen's diary and the Resistance's call to arms. Now Eleanor's cell coordinated with groups in France, Poland, and Norway to strike simultaneously, sabotage railways, bomb SS headquarters, and free prisoners from camps. The plan was audacious, banking on the Reich's internal chaos, Himmler's and Göring's factions at war, to weaken its defenses. Eleanor, haunted by Aisha's capture and the hope of finding her brother Tom, led a team to disrupt a Nazi armory in Manchester. "This is for everyone we've lost," she told her comrades, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. In Berlin, Oberst Hans Müller's world had collapsed. Arrested for his covert aid to the resistance, he sat in a Gestapo cell, its damp walls closing in. His leaks, camp layouts, propaganda studio plans, Himmler's purges, had fueled the uprising, but the cost was his freedom. During interrogation, the SS officer offered a deal: name his resistance contacts to avoid execution. Müller's thoughts turned to the Warsaw camp, the professor's empty gaze, and the lives he'd failed to save. "I have no names," he lied, his voice calm. That night, a sympathetic guard, swayed by the Beacon's reports, slipped Müller a key, whispering, "Get out. Join them." Müller escaped, fleeing to a resistance safe house in Berlin, his decision to defect a final break from the Reich. In London, Daniel Harper worked tirelessly, his The Beacon now a lifeline for the uprising. The Manchester Armory plan relied on his latest issue, smuggled across Europe, detailing SS troop movements based on Müller's intelligence. Reunited with Eleanor, Daniel saw the toll of her fight, her eyes shadowed by loss, yet fierce with purpose. "We're close," he told her as they pored over maps in the safe house. "America's sending aid, rifles, radios through Canada." Captain Reynolds, the U.S. naval officer, had defied Lindbergh's neutrality, funneling support to the resistance. But the Gestapo was relentless, and a traitor in Eleanor's cell, possibly linked to Aisha's capture, threatened to unravel their plans. The uprising erupted on April 15, 1956. In Paris, resistance fighters bombed an SS headquarters, the explosion shaking the city. In Warsaw, partisans freed prisoners from a labor camp, though many fell to SS gunfire. In Norway, saboteurs derailed a munitions train, its wreckage a symbol of defiance. In Manchester, Eleanor's team struck the armory, their explosives destroying tanks and rifles destined for the Eastern Front. But the SS responded with ferocity, executing hundreds in reprisal. Eleanor escaped, but half her team was captured, their screams echoing as she fled through the city's alleys. In Berlin, Müller, now a fugitive, joined a resistance cell planning to disrupt a Himmler-led rally. His knowledge of SS protocols proved invaluable, but the Gestapo tracked him and a firefight left him wounded. As he hid in a cellar, he wrote a final note to be smuggled to the Beacon: "I was part of the machine, but I choose to break it." In London, Daniel's latest issue, printed hours after the uprising, detailed the rebellion's successes and losses, reaching neutral countries and sparking protests in Stockholm and Bern. But the Gestapo raided his safe house, and only Eleanor's quick thinking saved him. The uprising failed to topple the Reich, its forces too entrenched, its reprisals too savage. Yet the spark of rebellion burned on. Eleanor, hiding in a new safe house, learned of a prisoner matching Tom's description, renewing her resolve. Müller, bandaged and hunted, vowed to fight with the resistance until his last breath. Daniel, his The Beacon now a global voice, prepared to publish again, knowing each word was a weapon. The Reich stood, but its foundations shook, and the world watched as hope refused to die. Conclusion. In the summer of 1960, the Third Reich stood as a colossus, its swastika banners fluttering over cities from Lisbon to Leningrad, its influence stretching to the deserts of Africa and the oil fields of the Middle East. The Neue Ordnung, forged in the wake of Britain's fall in 1940, had reshaped the world into a dystopia of control, where art, thought, and humanity were subordinated to an ideology of hate. Yet beneath this iron grip, the embers of resistance burned, fueled by the courage of those who refused to surrender their hope. The uprising of 1956, though crushed, had left cracks in the Reich's facade, and the voices of defiance, carried by Eleanor Caldwell, Hans Möller, Daniel Harper, and countless others, echoed into a new decade. Eleanor Caldwell, now a shadow moving through the ruins of occupied Europe, had become a legend among resistance fighters. The Manchester Armory sabotage and the 1956 uprising had cost her nearly everything: comrades, safety, and the fleeting hope of finding her brother Tom. A final lead, smuggled through Polish resistance channels, confirmed his death in Treblinka, a blow that nearly broke her. Yet, in a London safe house surrounded by maps and coded messages, Eleanor found purpose in the fight. The uprising had failed to topple the Reich, but it had inspired new cells in France, Norway, and beyond. Aisha, freed from Gestapo captivity by a daring raid, stood by her side, their bond forged in shared loss. "We keep fighting," Eleanor said, her voice steady, "for Tom, for everyone." Her cell planned a new wave of sabotage, targeting Reich infrastructure, a testament to her unyielding resolve. Hans Möller, once an Oberst of the Wehrmacht, had vanished into the resistance's ranks after his defection in 1956. His escape from the Gestapo's cell in Berlin marked a final break from the Reich, his life now dedicated to undoing the horrors he had once served. Hiding in a Polish forest, Müller worked with partisans, using his knowledge of SS tactics to disrupt supply lines. His journal, hidden in a resistance cache, chronicled his guilt and redemption. "I was complicit, but I will not die so. Let my actions speak." Wounded in a skirmish, he refused to retreat, guiding a raid that freed dozens from a labor camp. Though hunted by the SS, Müller's defection inspired other officers to question their loyalty, a ripple that weakened the Reich from within. Daniel Harper's The Beacon had become a global voice of truth, its pages smuggled to neutral countries and occupied territories alike. From a safe house in Stockholm, where he had fled after the 1956 raids, Daniel published accounts of the uprising, Miriam Cohen's diary, and Müller's intelligence, sparking protests in Sweden, Switzerland, and even the Americas. The U.S., stirred by Captain Reynolds' covert aid and public outrage, began funneling weapons to resistance networks, defying Lindbergh's fading regime. Daniel's reunion with Eleanor in London had forged a partnership, their combined efforts amplifying the Beacon's reach. Miriam's final diary entry, smuggled before her capture in Paris, ended with hope. "They cannot silence us all." Daniel honored her by publishing it, his words a rallying cry for a world waking to the Reich's atrocities. The Reich, though dominant, was not invincible. Himmler's consolidation of power after Göring's fall in 1956 had unified the leadership but exposed its fragility. Economic strain from proxy wars with the Soviet Union, coupled with resistance sabotage, drained resources. In Africa and the Middle East, local uprisings, inspired by Aisha's network, disrupted Nazi supply chains. The Soviet shadow loomed larger, its partisans clashing with SS forces in Ukraine and the Balkans. Neutral countries, once silent, began to act, their diplomats channeling funds to resistance groups. The world of 1960 was a tinderbox, where every act of defiance, Eleanor's sabotage, Müller's raids, Daniel's words, threatened to ignite a broader rebellion. This alternate world, born of a single divergence in 1940, stands as a stark reminder of the real history we escaped. The Allied victory in 1945, secured through sacrifice and resolve, prevented this dystopia of cultural erasure, mass murder, and global oppression. The courage of those who fought, soldiers, civilians, resistors, ensured a world where freedom, though imperfect, could flourish. In our reality, the Reich fell, its ideology consigned to history's ash heap. But the memory of what might have been lingers, a warning of the fragility of liberty and the power of those who refuse to yield. Eleanor, Muller, and Daniel, though fictional, embody the spirit of resistance that defined the real war. Their fight against impossible odds mirrors the countless unnamed heroes who stood against tyranny. In 1960, their world remains dark, but hope endures. Eleanor plans her next strike. Muller fights in the shadows, and Daniel's pen carves truth into the Reich's lies. Their legacy, like that of the real-world allies, is a testament to the human spirit's refusal to be broken. As we reflect on this imagined world, we honor the victory that spared us its horrors, and we vow to guard the light it preserved.